I had always thought we were happy. Our life together was far from perfect, but I believed in it, believed in him. Mark had always been a little distant, a bit more focused on his work than I liked, but that was just him, right? Everyone gets busy sometimes. That was my excuse when I noticed the late nights at the office, the phone calls he'd sneak away to answer, the way he started changing his appearance, buying new clothes, getting back into the gym, even getting a fresh haircut like he was trying to turn back time. I noticed it, but I didn't say anything. Maybe I was too busy with the boutique, with the business I had spent years building. Maybe I didn't want to face the reality I was afraid was coming. But when I found the receipts, that was when everything changed. It was late one evening when I went through our joint account statements, something I hadn't done in a while. There it was, a charge at an expensive restaurant, a charge for 2 people. The thing that stung the most was that he had claimed to be working late that night. I felt a knot in my stomach as I stared at the receipt. I told myself it didn't mean anything, but when I checked our credit card bills the next morning, I found more. Hotel charges from a place I'd never heard of, a hotel he never mentioned. My heart sank, but I didn't say a word. Instead, I sat there at the kitchen table, letting the silence fill the space between us as I planned my next move. I had been preparing for this, even if I hadn't fully admitted it to myself. Months earlier, when the signs were subtle, just enough to make me question things but not enough to confront him, I had opened a separate account. It was a small step, something I thought I'd never need. But now, looking at those receipts and the mounting evidence, I felt a strange comfort in knowing that I was ready. I had been watching. I had been keeping records. When I received a text from him that afternoon, a simple, almost casual goodbye, I didn't flinch. He thought he was leaving me in tears, imagining me begging him to stay. But there was no panic in me, no desperation. I felt calm. The text wasn't just a goodbye, it was a declaration of war. I'm leaving you, Claire. I've already emptied our joint account. I'm moving on with Melissa. Have a good life. The words stung, but I wasn't shocked. This wasn't the first time I'd suspected something was off. The signs had been there, and now they were staring me right in the face. I looked at the phone and let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. As I stood there, staring at his words, I felt a surge of something stronger than anger. It was power, the kind you find in silence, in knowing that you can handle whatever comes next. I didn't respond to his text. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and opened the bank account. Then, with careful hands, I transferred my savings into a new separate account. I knew I needed to protect myself and my business. I had worked too hard for this to be taken from me. My boutique, the dream I had nurtured, the one that kept me grounded, was mine. No one could take that from me. A few minutes later, I felt the familiar buzz of my phone. Another message from Mark. Don't bother begging, Melissa and I are leaving tomorrow. I'll send for my things later. The nerve. He actually thought I would beg him to stay. But I didn't reply. Instead, I dialed the lawyer I had consulted a few months ago, just in case. I had never planned for this, but I had always known there was a chance. And now, as I spoke to the lawyer on the phone, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. The divorce papers were ready. It was time. I went back to the boutique that afternoon, just like I did every day. It was busy, as usual, with customers walking in and out. But this time, as I greeted them, I felt something different. I wasn't just Claire, the owner of the boutique. I wasn't just the wife who had been betrayed. I was someone who was about to take control of her future, and no one, not even Mark, was going to stand in my way. The following days were a blur of legal calls, paperwork, and increasingly tense texts from Mark. He didn't seem to grasp the gravity of what he had done. Every time my phone buzzed, it was another arrogant message, as though he thought I would crumble under the weight of his betrayal. But I was different now. He had underestimated me. Don't worry about the house, his next message read. I'll let you stay there until you find something smaller. The audacity. That house was mine, my grandmother's legacy, the place I had inherited, and the place I had always cherished. It had nothing to do with him. I didn't even have to think twice before responding, or rather, before not responding at all. I simply forwarded his message to my lawyer, adding it to the growing pile of evidence. The next text was more mocking. "I know the shop means a lot to you," he wrote. "Maybe we can work out a fair payment for your half." His half. He had never cared for the business, always dismissing it as a hobby, a little shop that I poured my heart into while he mocked me for working long hours. I couldn't help but laugh, but I didn't respond to his text either. I knew that every word he sent was another mistake, another piece of evidence I could use. I spent that evening going through the details with my lawyer, reviewing everything I had collected over the past few months, receipts, text messages, financial records, and the hidden accounts. We discussed the next steps. The first hearing would be scheduled soon, but there was no rush. I didn't need to rush. He had already made his move, and I was ready for the next step. The phone buzzed again as I sat at my desk, organizing the shop's books for the next shipment. "I've been planning this for months," Mark wrote. "Melissa understands me in ways you never could." My fingers hovered over the screen, but I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my bank account app again. I was calm. I was prepared. By the time the weekend came, Mark's texts were relentless. His tone had shifted from casual and confident to desperate and condescending. Each new message seemed to reflect how far off track he had gotten. The final text that night was the worst yet. "I used our joint card to book flights and a hotel in Miami. Consider it my parting gift," he said. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a slow, creeping satisfaction. I had been waiting for him to make a mistake like this. I knew the moment he emptied our joint account, he would leave a trail, a path of destruction that would be impossible for him to cover up. And now, he had done just that. I didn't respond. I just got to work. I immediately called the credit card company. "Mrs. Harrison speaking," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to report fraudulent charges and cancel the card immediately." The representative on the other end was professional but couldn't hide her quiet satisfaction. "Can you identify the charges?" she asked. I rattled off the details, including the first-class flights to Miami and the hotel charges. When she asked for documentation, I told her I would be happy to forward the text messages Mark had sent me, his casual confession of using the card for his own escape. By the end of the call, the charges were canceled and Mark's flights and hotel reservations were voided. I smiled to myself. This was only the beginning. As I hung up the phone, my inbox filled with confirmation emails, the ones I had been waiting for, every transaction from the boutique, every record of savings and expenses, carefully documented, organized, and ready to be presented when the time came. The next morning, Mark called me. I let it go to voicemail. I knew it was only going to be more complaints, more accusations about how I was making everything difficult. But it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I had everything I needed. And Mark? He was the one digging himself deeper with every word. Monday arrived, and with it, the first hearing. I had spent the weekend in a blur of focused activity, meeting with my lawyer, organizing my records, and preparing for what was ahead. Every little detail had been carefully thought out. The documents were ready, the evidence was in place, and I had steeled myself for the battle that was coming. Mark's texts had slowed down, and I couldn't help but notice the shift in his tone. The arrogance that had once oozed from every message had faded, replaced by something else, desperation, guilt, or maybe both. But it was too late for that now. He had made his move, and he had underestimated me. When I walked into the courthouse that morning, I felt strangely calm. It was as though everything had led to this moment, and there was no turning back. Mark was already there, sitting in the back of the room, his posture stiff, eyes darting around nervously. I couldn't help but notice how different he looked. His clothes were too tight for his age, his face marked with the kind of nervous energy that comes when someone realizes they're losing control. Melissa wasn't with him. I almost wondered if she had backed out. My lawyer and I sat down at our designated table, and I could feel the eyes of the room on me. I wasn't just there to fight for my business and my assets. I was there to fight for everything I had worked for. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. It felt like a blur at first, my lawyer outlining the case, presenting evidence of financial misconduct, the documents that proved Mark had emptied our joint account without my consent, his use of shared credit cards for personal gain. Mark's lawyer tried to speak up, but I barely listened. I already knew how this would go. He had no leg to stand on. Then it was time for Mark to take the stand. He looked disheveled, his eyes avoiding mine as he spoke, his voice wavering. He tried to play it cool, tried to twist the narrative in his favor. "I didn't want things to go this way," he said, his tone thick with faux sympathy. "But Claire, she was cold, distant. I needed to move on." He paused and glanced at me, as though hoping I would respond, but I kept my face neutral. "I never wanted to hurt her," he continued, though I could hear the lie in his voice. "But she wouldn't let me go. She was too controlling." I could feel the anger rising, but I didn't let it show. I wasn't here to get into an emotional exchange. I was here to prove the truth. My lawyer stood up. "Mr. Harrison, I'd like to address a few facts," he said, his voice steady and clear. "You claim that Mrs. Harrison was controlling, but let's take a look at the evidence, shall we?" He motioned to the stack of documents in front of him, each one marked with dates and times, each one showing a pattern of deception. The judge leaned forward, his attention fully on my lawyer, as he laid out the case piece by piece. Mark's secret hotel stays, the text messages he had sent me admitting to his betrayal, and most damning of all, his use of our joint account to fund a trip with his girlfriend. The room grew silent as my lawyer presented the final piece of evidence, Mark's text message admitting to emptying the account and booking his flight. I could see the color drain from Mark's face as he heard the words read aloud. The judge looked at him, unimpressed. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice calm but firm, "your actions have been carefully documented. Your attempts to manipulate the situation have not gone unnoticed. It seems clear that you took advantage of the trust Mrs. Harrison placed in you." Mark's lawyer tried to protest, but the judge waved him off. "I've seen enough," he said. And just like that, it was over. I sat there, still, trying not to let the relief wash over me too quickly. Mark had made his mistakes, and now he was paying for them. The judge ruled in my favor, freezing all shared assets and ordering that any funds taken from our joint account be returned immediately. I didn't need to hear the rest. I had already won. As we left the courthouse, I could hear Mark's voice, weak and pleading, but I didn't look back. He had nothing left to say. He had made his choice, and now it was my turn to move forward. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The court ruling had been just the first step, and now the reality of it all started to sink in. Mark tried to fight it. Of course he did. He filed motion after motion, trying to get the ruling overturned, but it was clear from the start that his case had no real merit. My lawyer made quick work of each petition, and one by one, Mark's efforts to backpedal crumbled. Meanwhile, my boutique, the one he had always dismissed as just a hobby, was thriving. It had been gaining more attention than ever, and not just from regular customers. People in town were talking about what had happened. Word spread quickly, as it always does, and suddenly my business was the topic of conversation at every coffee shop and lunch table. Women came in, some to show support, others simply curious, and many left with bags full of expensive new items. My sales spiked. I'd been so focused on my own legal battles that I hadn't noticed how the entire town seemed to rally around me. It felt surreal, almost as if the universe was rewarding me for holding steady. Then came the call from the local magazine. They wanted to feature my story, not the story of a woman left behind after betrayal, but the story of a successful businesswoman who had overcome personal hardship to build something lasting. The idea that my failure in marriage was now something inspiring to others was both humbling and empowering. They didn't want to hear about Mark's mistakes, about how he'd tried to claim half of what I had built. They wanted to hear about my journey, my business, and how I had turned a painful chapter of my life into a success story. Still, Mark's presence loomed, like an uninvited guest. I started getting more and more texts from him, each one more desperate than the last. "You've ruined everything," he wrote one morning. "You've destroyed our family. You'll regret this." His words were full of venom, but I could feel the emptiness behind them. He wasn't angry with me. He was angry with himself. He had thought he could have it all, the young receptionist, the life in Miami, the money. But now he was stuck with nothing. A few days later, I received a call from Mark's mother. She was upset, her voice trembling as she tried to explain her son's actions. "Mark says you're being vindictive," she said, her tone filled with concern. "He says you're trying to take everything from him." I listened to her, not wanting to be cruel, but at the same time, not interested in defending my actions. I had done nothing wrong. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Barbara," I said gently. "But Mark is the one who emptied our joint account, who lied to me for months. I didn't leave him. He left me." There was silence on the other end before she sighed. "I never thought he'd do something like this," she whispered. "I don't know where we went wrong with him." I could hear the disappointment in her voice. "I raised him better than that." I let the silence hang for a moment before responding. "You did the best you could, Barbara. But Mark made his own choices. Now, it's up to him to deal with the consequences." I could tell the conversation wasn't going anywhere, and I didn't want to keep rehashing the past. "I think it's best if we don't stay in touch right now," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "This is a difficult time for all of us." She agreed, but I could hear the sadness in her voice as she ended the call. I hung up and took a deep breath. I wasn't angry with her. She wasn't the one who had betrayed me. But the reality was clear. Mark had alienated everyone around him. His own family was starting to see him for what he was. And it wasn't just me he had hurt. The following week, I received a call from my lawyer. The divorce settlement had been finalized. It wasn't just about the money or the assets anymore. It was about winning. And in the eyes of the law and in my own heart, I had. The boutique was mine. The house was mine. Everything I had worked for, everything that mattered was protected. Mark was left with nothing but his ego and his desperation. And now, it was time for him to face the reality that no one could save him. Not his family, not his new girlfriend, and certainly not the lies he'd been telling himself. I couldn't help but smile as I hung up the phone. This was it, the beginning of my new life. The weeks that followed felt like a breath of fresh air. The weight of the divorce, the endless back and forth with lawyers, and the suffocating cloud of Mark's betrayal slowly began to lift. The boutique was booming, and with every new shipment of high-end merchandise, my confidence grew. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. I had learned that my strength didn't come from relying on anyone else. It came from within me, from the careful steps I'd taken to protect myself, from the quiet resilience that had kept me grounded through the storm. Mark continued to send me texts, each more desperate and pleading than the last. "You've ruined me," he wrote one evening. "I have nothing left. I'll never forgive you for this." He was still under the delusion that I had somehow forced him into this mess, that his choices weren't his own. But I knew better now. It wasn't me who had taken everything from him. It was his own arrogance, his lies, and his betrayal that had led him to this point. I didn't respond. I had learned that silence was far more powerful than engaging with his manipulation. Then came the news that shook him even further. The company he had worked for, the one he had believed would carry him to bigger things, was downsizing. His position, the one he had once believed was secure, was eliminated. He was left scrambling to find a new job, something far below the status he had once enjoyed. But instead of taking responsibility for his actions, he blamed everyone else, his bosses, his colleagues, me, even the universe itself. His ego couldn't handle the fact that the life he had imagined for himself was slipping away, and he had no one to blame but himself. I heard about it from his sister, Amanda, when she showed up at the boutique one afternoon. She had always been polite to me, but our interactions had been few. This time, however, her tone was different. She was clearly uncomfortable, fidgeting with the edge of her scarf as she walked toward me. "I heard about Mark's job," she said hesitantly, clearly unsure of how to start the conversation. I smiled softly. not wanting to engage in anything that would add to her discomfort. "Yes, I heard," I replied. "He'll figure it out. He always does." But even as I said it, I could tell she wasn't here just to talk about his job. She hesitated, then spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say, Claire," she began. "We didn't know. We thought you were the problem. Mark, he made it sound like everything was your fault, that you pushed him away. But I've been seeing things differently lately." I raised an eyebrow, a little surprised. Amanda had always seemed so loyal to her brother. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. She shifted uncomfortably, then spoke in a rush. "I don't think he's telling the truth anymore. I've been watching him, and it's not just the job. He's blaming everyone for what happened between you two, but the truth is, I've seen how he's been treating people, how he treated you, and now how he's treating me. It's not right." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I just wanted to apologize. I should have listened to you sooner." I stood there, taken aback. This was the last thing I had expected. "It's okay," I said, though a small part of me was still surprised. "You were only getting one side of the story, Amanda, but thank you. I appreciate you saying that." After she left, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had always known that Mark had manipulated those around him, making them believe his version of the story. But to hear it from his own family, that was something else. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the truth finally coming to light, and about Mark being forced to face the consequences of his actions. A few days later, I ran into Mark at a local coffee shop. It wasn't planned, of course, but I wasn't surprised either. He looked tired, older somehow, the bags under his eyes a clear sign of the stress he had been under. He glanced at me, and for a brief moment our eyes locked. There was no anger, no frustration, just a quiet acknowledgement that everything had changed. He opened his mouth, as though he was going to say something, but no words came out. Instead, he sighed deeply, shaking his head. "I didn't think it would end like this," he muttered, almost to himself. I could have said 1,000 things in that moment, could have brought up the texts, the lies, the way he had treated me, but instead I simply smiled. "Life doesn't always go the way we expect," I said quietly, "but we have to keep moving forward." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, a man who had finally realized the magnitude of his mistakes. And as I walked back to my boutique, I realized something. He was no longer my problem. He had lost everything that mattered to him, while I was gaining everything I had ever dreamed of. As the months passed, my life began to feel like it was on a steady, upward trajectory. The boutique was doing better than ever. I had expanded, hired more staff, and even started an online store that quickly gained traction. I spent most of my time managing the business, meeting with clients, and continuing to grow my brand. The thought of Mark and the mess he had left behind was becoming more distant with each passing day. But every now and then, I would hear something about him, usually from mutual acquaintances or occasionally from his mother. Apparently, Mark's new life wasn't going as smoothly as he had hoped. Word spread that he was struggling. He'd moved into a cheap apartment above a garage, and his job situation was dire. His attempts at dating were equally unsuccessful. Women his age weren't interested in a man who had spent years coasting on his charm and appearances, only to be brought down by his own mistakes. Younger women, the ones he thought would swoon over his midlife crisis persona, quickly saw through him. I heard through a friend that he had tried online dating, but his profile, despite the young, carefree photo, was a complete turnoff. His bio claimed he was young at heart, but his age and his obvious lack of direction painted a different picture. "He's not fooling anyone," my friend said with a laugh. "No one wants a man who can't even take care of himself." It was hard to feel sorry for him. There was a part of me, a tiny part, that almost did. He had made his choices, and now he was paying the price. But I couldn't deny that I felt a strange sense of vindication. He had spent years undermining me, belittling my dreams, and now he was the one left scrambling, trying to put his life back together after burning every bridge he could. In contrast, my boutique had become a local staple. The story of the betrayed wife who turned her pain into success had inspired many. Customers came in, not just to shop, but to tell me how my story had given them strength. Many of them had been through their own struggles, and seeing me succeed was a reminder that you could always bounce back, no matter the circumstances. And then there was Melissa. She was the young receptionist Mark had left me for. I hadn't heard much about her after the divorce, but rumors had a way of finding their way to me. She had moved on to another coworker at his office, someone her own age, someone who could offer her stability. Apparently, she had started her own social media consulting business, something I had heard through a mutual acquaintance. I found it oddly satisfying that she too had learned the lesson the hard way. She had been so convinced that Mark was her escape, the solution to her problems. But now, she was learning that he was just another distraction, someone to help her avoid the work of building a real future. One afternoon, as I was unpacking a new shipment of handbags, my assistant manager came to me with an unexpected update. "Melissa came into the store today," she said, her voice quiet. "She seemed different. She asked about you." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Did she say why?" "Not exactly," my assistant replied. "But she seemed to regret some things. She said she thought you were controlling before, but now she realizes it wasn't about control. It was about you knowing what you wanted, and she wished she had listened to you." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to say, "I told you so," but I didn't. There was no need. She had learned her lesson, and I had moved on. The fact that she had the courage to come in, to acknowledge the truth, was enough. A few weeks later, I saw her again. She came in on a busy Friday afternoon, looking a little out of place, but there was something different in her eyes. She didn't seem like the same person who had laughed loudly at Mark's jokes, pretending to be the center of his attention. This time she looked tired, but there was a quiet strength about her. "I owe you an apology," she said, standing in front of me. She looked a little embarrassed, but I could see the sincerity in her eyes. "I believed everything Mark told me about you, how you were too controlling, how you didn't support his dreams. But now I get it. I see what you were trying to do." I nodded, not saying anything for a moment. There was nothing to be gained by rehashing the past. "You're not the first person to believe his version of things," I said softly, "and you won't be the last. But it's not about proving anything to anyone anymore. It's about living my life on my terms." She looked at me, her eyes wide, as if she had just come to a realization. "I thought I was going to find happiness with Mark," she continued, her voice hesitant. "But I was just running away from things. Now I realize I need to build something real." I smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "That's the first step," I said. "You can't build your life on someone else's mistakes. You have to build it yourself." She nodded, her face softening with understanding. "I'm dating someone now," she said, almost shyly. "Someone my age. We don't have a lot, but we're building something together. It's real, you know?" I smiled again, not just because of what she said, but because I could see that she had found her own path. "Good for you," I said. "That's all anyone really needs, someone to build a future with." As she left, I felt a strange sense of peace. The past was behind me, and even the people who had once been part of it were finding their own ways to move on. Mark had tried to rewrite his story, but the truth always finds its way to the surface. As for me, I had built something stronger than I ever imagined. My boutique was growing, my life was mine, and no one, not even Mark, could take that away from me. As the years passed, my life seemed to settle into a rhythm I could finally appreciate. My boutique had grown into something bigger than I had ever dreamed. With multiple locations across the city and an expanding online presence, I had transformed my passion into a thriving business empire. I was no longer just a woman who had been left behind. I was a force to be reckoned with in the business world. And it wasn't just about the money or the success. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of standing on my own, that I didn't need anyone to define me. The news of Mark's continued struggles was no longer a surprise. Each time I heard something new about him, it was as if he had become a cautionary tale to everyone who had once believed in his charm. His attempts to climb the corporate ladder were unsuccessful, and the company that had once promoted him now seemed to be moving in a different direction. He was still trying to find a foothold in a world that had long moved past him. I heard through Amanda that Mark had tried to blame his failure on everything but himself. The people at his old job, his ex-girlfriend, even me, everyone but the one person who deserved the blame. He had tried to claim that his troubles were because of age discrimination, but the truth was far simpler. He had burned every bridge he could, and no one was willing to help him anymore. His past actions were catching up to him, and there was no escape from the reality of his mistakes. In the meantime, my boutique was thriving. I had expanded into luxury accessories, a new market I hadn't even considered at the beginning, and it was working. I was receiving attention from national fashion magazines, and people were starting to recognize my name outside of my small town. There were days when I would stand in the middle of one of my stores, looking around at the hustle and bustle of it all, and realize that I had built something remarkable. From the ground up, I had created a business that was respected and loved. I had done it on my own, without relying on anyone's help, and certainly without Mark's approval. Yet, despite all the success, there was still that lingering feeling of satisfaction that came from knowing he would never be able to take credit for any of it. He had spent so much time trying to diminish what I had built, thinking it was nothing, that now he would have to watch from the sidelines as I continued to expand. I received a call one afternoon from my lawyer, who was handling the final bits of paperwork related to the divorce settlement. "Mark's at it again," she said with a sigh. "He's filed another petition to revisit the settlement. He claims the distribution was unfair, that he deserves more because of his contributions to the business." I laughed softly to myself, shaking my head. The man who had mocked my business, who had belittled it for years, was now trying to claim part of it. "Tell him to keep trying," I replied, my voice steady. "There's nothing left for him to take." "Actually," my lawyer continued, "the judge dismissed his claim again, and just to add a little more salt to the wound, Mark has been ordered to pay the court costs this time." I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, and I couldn't help but share it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Mark had thought he could take it all, my money, my business, my dignity. But in the end, he was left with nothing. Every time he tried to challenge the settlement, it was another reminder of how little power he had left. Not long after, I received a letter from the court confirming that his latest petition had been dismissed. The words on the page felt almost like a victory lap. This time, it wasn't about the assets or the business anymore. It was about him realizing that his attempts to rewrite history would always fail. He couldn't undo the past. The final straw came when I received a message from Mark's mother. Her voice was calm, almost resigned as she spoke. "Mark's tried to reach out again," she said, her tone softer than I had ever heard it. "He's struggling, Claire. He's blaming everyone else. But I think he's finally starting to see that it's not anyone else's fault. It's his own doing." I listened to her quietly, surprised by the shift in her tone. "I don't know what to say anymore, Barbara," I replied honestly. "I tried to help him when I could, but he made his own choices, and now he has to live with them." She sighed. "I wish I had understood that sooner. I should have told him that he couldn't keep blaming others. You've done well, Claire. I'm proud of you." I was taken aback by her words, but there was a sense of closure in them. There was no more animosity, no more false accusations. Mark's family had finally come to terms with the truth, and it wasn't the version he had painted. It was the version I had lived, and I had triumphed. That evening, as I sat in my office at the boutique, surrounded by the success I had worked so hard to achieve, I felt a quiet pride in everything I had built. Mark had thought he could diminish me, reduce me to nothing, but he had only made me stronger. His cruelty had set a fire under me, and I had used it to build something incredible. I was no longer the woman who had been betrayed. I was the woman who had become more than what anyone had ever thought I could be. And as I watched the sun set over the city, I knew that no matter what came next, I was ready for it. 5 years had passed since the divorce, and when I thought back on everything that had happened, I hardly recognized the woman I had been then. I had come so far, further than I ever thought possible. My boutique chain now had 5 locations, each one a thriving testament to everything I had worked for. From the small shop that had barely scraped by to the business empire I had built, every inch of progress was proof that resilience, preparation, and an unwavering belief in myself could turn the darkest moments into something extraordinary. The story of my success had become a source of inspiration for many, and I was invited to speak at women's business conferences to share how I had transformed my pain into power. It wasn't just about the divorce anymore. It was about how to protect your assets, how to trust your instincts, and how to build something solid on your own, without relying on anyone else to validate your worth. The best part was that I didn't have to tell my story for sympathy or pity. I told it because it was real, because it showed what could happen when you didn't give up, no matter how many times life knocked you down. The boutique had expanded beyond what I had ever imagined. We were not just a local name anymore. We had customers from across the country and even overseas. It was my dream realized, but more than that, it was a symbol of how far I had come. Every new collection, every new store opening was another chapter in my journey. I wasn't just a business owner, I was a leader, a woman who had risen from the ashes and built something that would last. And then there was Mark. I had stopped thinking about him long ago, but his name still popped up every now and then, like an old ghost refusing to stay in the past. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he had finally moved out of his parents' house. He had taken a low-paying job at a small company after the downsizing of his former employer. His dating profile still claimed he was young at heart, but the women he met weren't buying it. They saw through the facade, just as I had. He had squandered every opportunity he had, and now he was left with little more than regret. I didn't take pleasure in hearing about his struggles. That wasn't the point. The point was that I had built something real, something lasting, and he, in his arrogance and entitlement, had thrown everything away. His life was a series of failed attempts, while mine had become a story of success and empowerment. The contrast was striking, but it was no longer something that mattered to me. He had played his part in my story, and now he was irrelevant. One day, as I was preparing for the grand opening of our newest location, I received a message from Melissa. It had been years since we last spoke, but the message felt different this time. She apologized for everything, for believing Mark's lies, for falling for his charm, for not understanding the bigger picture when it mattered. She admitted that she had learned the hard way, just as I had. She had started her own business now, a small social media consulting firm, and was doing well. I wasn't sure what to say at first. I could have told her that I had always known she would learn the truth eventually, but I didn't. Instead, I simply replied, "I'm glad to hear you're doing well. I hope you've found what you're looking for." The message felt like the final chapter, not just of my story, but of all the years I had spent focused on Mark, on the hurt, the betrayal, and the anger. It was all behind me now. What mattered was the future. What mattered was where I was going, not where I had been. That evening, I stood in the newest boutique location, watching the final touches being made before the doors opened for the grand event. The buzz of excitement in the air, the anticipation of the guests arriving, the thought of how far I had come. It all filled me with a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. I wasn't the woman who had been discarded and forgotten. I was the woman who had taken control, who had chosen to rise, and who had built a future no one could take from me. Mark had thought he could end my story with his cruel text message, but all he had done was start a new one, a better one. And as I looked out at the sea of smiling faces, friends, customers, and loyal staff, I knew that this was only the beginning. The woman I was today was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The best part? I had done it all on my own terms. Success had been the sweetest revenge all along.